Boardroom Bound, Episode 29, How to Drive Superior Results by Serving Others, with Cheryl Bachelder.
In the boardroom, there is no such thing as a stupid question, just like you've heard that expression in other aspects of life. And I do think in the boardroom we hold back because we want to be experienced and we want to have gravitas and all these things. But I really would encourage new members to speak up, ask anything that doesn't make sense, point out anything that doesn't hang together in the materials, because you may be finding something that no one else has had the perception to see.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we're speaking with Cheryl Bachelder, and she is an incredibly experienced board member, serves on multiple high-profile public companies, and she's going to explain how she built her brand and her reputation as someone who delivered well, and different boards saw different parts of her expertise and skill set and brought her on to help with those, whether it was turning around a brand or industry expertise in the fast food service industry, and how one of those grew to a different one just because she did very well in her first board role and the networking that happened. So Cheryl's going to walk us through that today and explain how she landed working at great board roles such as Popeyes, Pier Imports, U.S. Foods, Chick-fil-A, companies that we know and names that we recognize, and the way that worked for her. And she does it with her candor and ease and great stories. I'm also excited to share with you today the news that the ballot box is still open for the 14th Annual People's Choice Podcast Awards. It's been really exciting for me to see the votes coming in from our audience, and thank you to those who've participated. And for those who haven't, it's not too late. During the entire month of July, they are taking votes for the top 10 finalists, and we are nominated under the business category. Previous winners are Freakonomics, NPR's Planet Money, big leading names in the industry that you would know. So it's a thrill to be part of that. And we would encourage more of our audience to participate. It's very simple to go to podcastawards.com. The nominations are open. You click on that box, you select Boardroom Bound under business category, and you save your nomination. And the voting will continue through the end of July, and the top 10 vote getters go to the final round to be selected. And it's a thrill for us to be participating in that, and we appreciate all of you who are helping cast votes. Cheryl Bachelder, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and the timing is perfect. So this is all about how people get their board seats, and congratulations. I know you've just added another one, as if you needed more on your plate already. You added another one in Chick-fil-A now.
Yes, I'm excited about that. I wanted to stay very active in the restaurant industry. And Chick-fil-A is considered the best quick-service restaurant on so many fronts: service, food, the way they do business. I'm just proud to be a part of their company.
Well, I know in my family, we don't have them nearby us very often, so we're on road trips. We tend to plan out stops to go see them, so that's always good fun for us. And I think it would be really helpful for our audience to understand the context of how you got here. So now you are on several high-profile board positions now, but for you, it was a transition, moving up the ranks at so many great named companies, becoming the CEO of Popeyes, doing an amazing job with the turnaround there, and we'll talk about your book that chronicles that. But if you could help the audience understand perhaps how you got to where you are today, that you have a portfolio of board roles.
Well, I think you're right. I think it began with the career that I pursued, which the theme of my career ended up being turning around iconic brands. I started at Procter & Gamble, where I learned all about brand leadership. I went on to Gillette and then Nabisco, where I was known for turning around the Planters nuts and snacks business, and then the Lifesavers candy business. So, your experiences of your career are formative, to be sure, but they also form the basis of what interest a board might have in you. And so my first board seat was on True Value Hardware, I often joked that because I was the first woman on their board, that I brought along paint color expertise to all the plumbing and electricians and all the other great technical skills that were on that board. But it really was a lovely beginning experience as a board member. The board operated very professionally, really valued the complementary skills of the different people in the room. And it was not a public company, so it was a little bit safer place, if you will, to learn how to operate in the boardroom ahead of a public company assignment. Because after that, I went on the Popeyes board. After my experience at KFC, they valued my industry experience and put me on the board, and that obviously turned into a job. Within a year, I was named their CEO and served as their CEO for 9.5 years. And so sometimes a board seat's towards the end of your career, and sometimes a board seat is part of your career.
And that wasn't the last time that happened to you. I know we'll get to that.
Yes, that's exactly right. So Popeye's board service was a great experience, but it ended up far more being a career experience as I was a public company CEO there. Then at the same time I was on the Popeye's board, I went on the Pier 1 Imports board in Fort Worth, Texas, a fabulous retailer that brings adventurous home decor items to you so you don't have to travel the world for them. And I've served on that board since 2012, so about 7 years. And I'm currently serving there as interim CEO after the departure of their CEO last December. So, again, board service has been both a wonderful learning experience, but also on occasion you step into the leadership role as necessary or as the board requires. So, I guess to fill out the dance card, my other recent board addition was U.S. Foods, which is a large United States food distributor out of Chicago, services many of the restaurants that you would go to, from fine dining to quick service. And I joined their board last October. So today I serve on Pier 1's board, U.S. Foods, and Chick-fil-A.
And for so many people, that's just an impressive resume, right? You think about your board group, but let's break that down a little bit, how it works. So I think for a lot of our audience, maybe if we think about it as where you want to go someday, we all hear we probably want to be a public company board director. And you started at True Value, that was a private firm. How did that position open up? Were you approached? Did you network? Did they come find you based on your background and experience? How did that actually happen?
So one of the things that has changed in board service in the last 20 years has boards have been begun using search firms to help them fill board positions. It probably was the result of some scrutiny of how boards are formed. I believe it's been really positive because what it has led to is the search firms ask the boards to profile themselves and their skill sets, and then to share what skill sets are required for the strategies of that business, and then form a good match with new board members who have the skills required for the future strategies of the company. It's a very defined, planful process that search firms bring a lot of expertise to. So I think that's been a huge positive advancement. It certainly has been an advancement for women and minorities because we were not always in the social or informal networks that led to board service. So I would tell you I'm now called about boards in many cases because I'm a female CEO, but that probably wouldn't have happened as often without this becoming more of a disciplined process. And so that is how I came to True Value, is a search firm that knew my career path called me up about that True Value opportunity.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking with one of the partners at Heidrick & Struggles who runs some of their board practices, and he told me we will no longer ever put up a candidate slate without at least one female now because we believe in diversity, and diversity means more than just gender, of course. So it's interesting you talk about that, but I think there's also a big part of it as well. The CEO of a public company is also a big thing, because there used to be a view that you had to be a CEO, maybe a CFO as well, in the C-suite certainly, in order to be on a board. And if you think about, well, we need diversity, we need more females, there aren't that many female CEOs, which is a whole other problem that we could spend another episode on as well. But in some ways, so now you've been on public company boards, you've been the CEO of public companies. I imagine there are probably so many people that would like to round out your dance card if you had more time. But to some people, that feels like, well, that's a problem I could solve later once I've become more popular and my brand and awareness has risen. But let's talk about how you were working on True Value. That was your first experience. I agree, a private company for so many people, perhaps in a less litigious way, less scrutiny way. There's a lot more opportunities to grow and develop there. You served for 6 or 7 years, and you probably really figured out what it meant to excel as a board member. During that process, can you give us a sense where you realized I should do more of these because I realized this about myself or what I like? How did that process work for you?
Well, the first thing I remember is that one of my girlfriends, who was a senior executive, she actually owns her own company, had said to me, you know, Cheryl, you need to start getting prepared for board service. And I said, well, how would you do that? And she goes, well, actually, I was going to go to a training in Chicago, and I can't go, so I'm going to gift you that training. And she sent me to a program at Northwestern University around women in the boardroom, and it was a 4-day intensive training for board service. And at that event, I met lots of, in this case, female board members, and it really opened my eyes up to what board service is. And for me, I think it's just another way you can bring your business experience and your business passion to another company. I got very intrigued by it. That then led to me being receptive to a phone call from a search firm who said, you know, we've got this True Value opportunity, and they called it a starter board, which I wasn't in any way offended by. I said, that's correct. I've never served on a board. I don't have experience. So I was very open-minded to that opportunity and willing to take some risk on my part of saying, look, I don't really know if this is the perfect board for me, but it'll give me some experience. I'll meet other board members. I'll learn how this works. And I would tell you my real training happened from learning from the other board members in the room once I got to True Value. I was placed on a board that had 3 or 4 veteran board members on it that were serving on other company boards. All of them became good colleagues and friends over the 6-7 years that I served there. But what they really were is they were my trainers to show me what it looks like in the boardroom, because the boardroom is very different than running a company. It is policy, it's oversight, it's risk management, and it's learning how to listen carefully before you speak. It's probably no secret that CEOs usually speak before they listen. So you really do need to be, it needs to be explained to you that to be very careful with your words and very careful not to interject too soon in the boardroom and give management the opportunity to really lay out their thinking. So the most important thing about your first board search is to learn from the other board members.
And so can I probe on that a little bit? So you are now on these mega company boards, right? Some are very high profile. And if someone is being added to your board and it's their first board seat, do you view it as, I recognize this person will have a learning curve and it's my job, I don't know if it's pass it forward, pay it forward for them to help them grow and develop? Or is there an expectation that they should start on maybe a lower level starter board and work their way up to get to these sorts of perspectives? How do you and your colleagues think about that?
Well, I'll give you a specific example. At Pier 1, in the last couple of years, we have brought on 2 first-time board members. And we did so because we really needed their skill sets and their experiences. One was a former chief marketing officer in the technology field, and the other was a supply chain executive. And we said, you know what, we need those skills, and we're going to look deeply for expertise in these areas. And it turned out the 2 people that we found really interesting in the interview process had not served on a public board. So to your point, when we brought them on, we committed to them, listen, we will give you an orientation. We will make ourselves all available to you so that you learn how to approach the boardroom differently than your day jobs. And to their credit, these two individuals were very welcoming of insight from other board members. They reached out themselves and said, listen, Cheryl, can you tell me what it's like to serve on this board? And can you give me feedback if I get, off track in the way I'm contributing? They've been very receptive to feedback. So I think their humility and desire to learn has been a big part of it.
And clearly that was a good cultural fit for your board, right? And the right perspective. And that approach may not be true on every board. And I know, for example, some boards are notorious at having very good onboarding programs, others not so much. And do you advise someone going through the process, seeking a board seat, how do you figure out not only the larger cultural perspective to make sure you fit, but the kind of support and guidance you may or may not find?
Well, probably the trickiest thing to understand in an interview process is the culture of the board. Boards are interesting from a culture standpoint because they typically only meet 4 times a year. So they have to come together and quickly be effective, and then they don't see each other again for 3 months. I think culture of a board is basically the culture of the team that's been assembled. So as you interview, really understanding where each board member's coming from and judging for yourself in the interview process, how do I think that board member is going to behave in the boardroom, and am I going to be able to be collaborative with that person? Because that's going to get tested live at the first board meeting, at the first risk issue you review together. And it's very important, basically, that everybody in the room be a grown-up and behave accordingly. So I would tell you, very important to check out the board members that you're going to serve with, and if you can, learn about them from other colleagues who have met them professionally or seen them or heard their reputations, so that you kind of know what behavior will be operative in the boardroom. Not nearly as easy to grab hold of as maybe a corporate culture that's been established over the years.
And do you recommend, and perhaps it's a question of do you do this to yourself, as you're thinking about another board seat, so you're preparing to potentially take on the Chick-fil-A, do you suggest that, I'd love to be a fly in the wall, sit in at one of the meetings to see what it's like, sign whatever NDA situation you might need? I've heard that recommended by some people. Is that an approach that you take and advocate?
I've actually never done that. And it's a good suggestion, but I've also never seen it offered at the boards that I've served on. So I think it would be a pretty transparent board that would be comfortable doing that. I think you're more likely going to get help on board culture by asking questions about it in the interview process, particularly with the board chair. The board chair typically is responsible for taking feedback on the board's performance and coaching board members on their performance. So usually the board chair can be really helpful, or the governance chair can be very helpful to you. And of course, if you do have that opportunity to sit in, that's ideal, because seeing it live would be the best possible way to assess.
And I'm thinking back to the conversation we were just having a little bit earlier about someone who's brand new in terms of board positions. And that's sort of that chicken egg thing. How do you get a job, that experience, how do you experience without a job, right? So you've got to get your first board role at some point. On one of our prior episodes, Gordon Hall was talking about, he said, as a board chair, he insists that they always have someone who's brand new to board service. And he says that because, look, I know if I've served for this company for 5 or 10 years, I have a lot of the information in my head. I know, say, with the quarterly filing, I only need to look for the changes. But I want someone who's brand new, who's diligent, who's going to read everything from scratch 3 times and comes up with the great questions of, hey, why do we do it this way? Have we ever thought about the other way? And when we think about diversity of thought, I can see how that would add a ton of value. What is your take on that?
Well, I very much agree with that premise. Your new board members are rigorously going through the materials with a different lens than you might have, and they will bring up new questions that you want to make sure they ask because they'll be so fresh to the materials. In the boardroom, there is no such thing as a stupid question, just like you've heard that expression in other aspects of
Right.
life. And I do think in the boardroom we hold back because we want to be experienced and we want to have gravitas and all these things. But I really would encourage new members to speak up, ask anything that doesn't make sense, point out anything that doesn't hang together in the materials, because you may be finding something that no one else has had the perception to see. There's another way that I've seen this be important. It's important to have people who are currently sitting in leadership jobs and to have retired expertise in the boardroom. Retired people have more time to read the board book and
Right.
opine and reflect, but people sitting in the job might have been dealing with that problem yesterday and have a very current insight into how to deal with that risk or that problem, whether it's cybersecurity or a personnel issue. So I love a mix of experienced and less experienced, retired and sitting executives, female and male, international executive and U.S. executive, every kind of diversity possible to ensure you're looking at the enterprise's opportunity through multiple lenses.
And I would agree that you can't have innovative thinking unless you have diversity of thought, which comes from such a wide range of background experiences and ages and whatnot have you. And Cheryl, you talked a bit at the beginning of you had a certain background and brand and experience, and you gave different examples of why different boards are reaching out to you based upon that and why you were a fit. And perhaps you can opine for some of our audience, if someone is positioning themselves, and it could be a month from now, a year from now, several years from now, thinking, this is something I want to move into, this is something I want to be able to say that I've done, I'm encouraged about the experience and the opportunity. How does someone build that sort of authority platform that others are finding them and saying, oh, this person is someone that we should know and have on our radar and should consider for an opportunity?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is know what the work of the board is. Educate yourself on what the actual workings of a board focus on. Certainly strategy is a focus of the board. Hiring and developing a CEO is the focus of the board. Board governance, audit committee and all the public filings, compensation, and all the talent functions are the work of a whole committee. Risk management. So one, get informed on the work of the board so that you know where experience is required. And then look at your career interests and career contributions and say, what do I really want to drive towards when I get to the point in my life where I serve on a board? My strong suit was brand turnaround strategy, or strategy would be the general category. So I would say to a prospective board, listen, I do not have a CPA degree. I'm not an audit partner. I'm not your audit chair. But what I do have interest in is business strategy, and I also have a strong interest in talent and culture, which could be compensation committee. And I always presented which part of the board I thought I could add the most value in so that they could look at the skill grid of the people they had in the room and figure out whether I was a good fit or not. You don't really want to get selected for a board that you're not a good fit for.
Right.
Right? It's the same thing as a job, right? You want them to know who you are, know how you contribute best. And then you need to create a story out of your career contributions that show them how rock solid your skills are in that particular area. For me to be able to talk about the turnaround of Planters Nuts, the turnaround of Domino's Pizza, and then eventually the turnaround of Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen gave me really concrete stories of my experiences. It gave me different perspectives. One of them was done under a private equity partner. One of them was public. There were variants in each of those stories. One of them was more about marketing. One of them was more about product innovation. And so over a long period of time, because board service is typically towards the latter years of your career, I developed a pretty good arsenal of stories that defended my role as a strategist.
And I guess at this point, for the Popeyes one, for the answer, do you just hand them a copy of your book? I kid. But let's just give a shout out for the book for a moment, because I do want to uncover this for people. So you gloss over it very quickly, but the turnaround that you did at Popeyes is incredible, and the way you approach it, and you've incorporated that into the book, that you share your stories, and it's when I read through it, it's not the typical lens that I would expect from this sort of book. And I'd love for you just to share a little bit about that with us.
Well, the Popeye story is so fun to tell. It is a story of a team that came together to create a turnaround plan. And the way we turned around that company was so distinctive competitively that it caught a lot of people's eyes, not just our results, but how we got our results done. So I wrote the book to tell that story. The book is called Dare to Serve, How to Drive Superior Results by Serving Others. And it basically is a practitioner's story of how you use the tenets of something called servant leadership, thinking of others more often than yourself, as the basis for a business turnaround that created exceptional performance results competitively. At Popeyes, our business results are touted as the strongest turnaround in the history of quick service restaurants. There's all kinds of hyperbole, but the reason is the results were phenomenal. The sales of the restaurants increased by 50%. The market share went up by 75%. The profits doubled, and the share price went from low teens, $12, $13, to the sale price of the company was $79 in March of 2017. So it was quite a phenomenal story from a numbers perspective. That gave us the credibility to tell us our how story, and we focused on making the franchisee owners of Popeyes wildly successful. We decided to serve them and to measure all aspects of our performance through their lens. And by doing so, we created the highest satisfaction among franchise owners in the history of the industry. The survey said that they were 95% satisfied with our leadership, which is kind of unheard of. That had grown from a mediocre 76% satisfied when we started. And it was that level of partnership that we had with our franchise owners and the process by which we worked with them that led to incredible performance. So we love to tell the story. The book is written in a really easy, accessible format that allows you to ask yourself the same 40 questions we ask ourselves, and assess your own approach to leadership as you go. So people have found that really engaging, because it's not just the Popeye story, but it's also your story. And so I offer that up to anyone who's looking really to advance their leadership ability.
And I love the story and the message you share, and I will make sure we have a link to that in the show notes. And I did find it was a great flip through. And I also love on your Insta feed, I get a lot of the good quotables that come out of that, right? So that's good fun. And
well, thank you.
For me, as I think through your career, so you had this incredibly successful opportunity, and naturally as a fit from that, right, you would think board roles would be a success. But of course, as we talked about earlier, then to some extent you're a board director and one role brought back into the CEO suite temporarily while that is being sorted through. When you think about your career now and how you define it, I'm guessing we would say a portfolio of board roles is what you have. And for many in our audience who are thinking, maybe I'm just landing my first seat, there's probably got to be a mental shift to go from doing, in addition to being an executive, to doing one board role, to eventually probably leaving the executive suite and doing lots of board roles. What has that been like for you, and what guidance would you give to others?
Well, first of all, if you are a full-time executive, one board seat is plenty. Because you want to give that board your very best, and that means you always want to come prepared to the meetings. You want to do reading on the industry to keep yourself well informed about their business model. It's probably quite different than your own. And you want to make sure that your reputation is built by the way you participate in that organization. So don't give it short shrift. I will tell you that I have seen first-time board members who didn't understand that attendance is required at every board meeting. Preparation is required at every board meeting. This is a real responsibility, and the company counts on you to do your part. So take it seriously. Just do one to start. You'll learn plenty from that experience. And then, as you said, there'll be a time when you're no longer an executive and you may want to do 2 or 3 or 4. That's probably the max. But that it can become a full-time job if you want it to in the later years of your career. So in my case, I tried not to overcommit while I was a sitting executive. In fact, in a public company, there's often a rule that your board will not allow you to sit on more than one other board, and they certainly must approve any board service that you take on. So I was always careful to make sure I asked my board chair, had permission before I got into the finalist position of any board search. And then after that, it's about doing it well. You eventually are asked to serve as a committee chair. While I was CEO of Popeyes, I became the compensation committee chair at Pier 1. This would have been many years back, and that's a lot more work than just being a board member. There's all the preparation of the short-term incentive plans, the long-term incentive plans. The proxy has a major section on compensation that the comp committee is responsible for. So it was a much bigger job when I became comp chair, and I had to therefore dedicate more time, more preparation, and also more education time. I needed to go to a couple of seminars each year on developing compensation practices. I needed to have in-between meetings with a compensation consultant. I needed to read reports from ISS and Glass Lewis, the advisories on CEO compensation. Many, many ways that you need to stay active and prepared when you're a committee chair. That's probably the biggest change that happens in board service is when you take on a committee chair role. So don't do that without a thoughtful consideration of how much time it will take.
Well, Cheryl, we've also talked about a bit of the evolution of the board today. So clearly more diversity of thought, as we discussed. You talked about how maybe 20 years ago or so that really when the executive search firms became very important in the process as well. And as we look ahead, what do you suggest or predict about the future of the boardroom? What sort of additional changes do you think are coming down the pike?
Well, I think 2 things are happening in the boardroom that are going to require a lot of us as board members. One is widely discussed, but I think we don't often think about the implications, and that is the speed of change. The rate at which technology is changing the way business is conducted, for example, requires board members to remain incredibly current. You know, my experience 30 years ago is not relevant today in the day of the cell phone and the iPad and the laptop and the app and all that. I have to keep myself far more contemporary to be useful in the board meeting. I have to know about cybersecurity, which didn't even exist 20 years ago. So I think the first onus is on continuous improvement and education of a board member. The worst board member you could be is somebody that says, well, back in 1992, I did this, and it was amazing. And everybody's like, yeah, that was before you had a cell phone. You've got to be really contemporized in your experiences and the anecdotes that you share. So staying connected to networks and staying very well read, Harvard Business Review, Boardroom magazines, general business publications, reading the Wall Street Journal. Those are all things board members have to do to stay current. Last thing you want to do is become dated. The second thing I would point to is because change is fast, we're managing higher degree of risk. The way the world's being reshaped by Amazon-type players is putting traditional companies in a much different risk position and requiring them to change much more dramatically. So risk management is something I think you need to be very experienced in and very prepared for. How do you assess risk? How do you test for risk? How do you know everything you need to know about a company and how they handle risk? You have to ask some very deep, curious questions like, do you run risk drills on your cybersecurity? Do you test your systems in case they might break down? How you would conduct business without a point of sale system? Getting really granular at where risk lies, what could go wrong, and are the proper assessments and tests occurring today? today, a substantial part of a board meeting is considering risk and whether the company's doing everything they can to mitigate it.
Well, Cheryl, I feel like we have covered such a wide range of opportunities and positions and histories today, and it's amazing to sort of watch your career journey as we walk through it today. And clearly all the companies you've been working with are blessed by your careful and your considered perspective, and I know our audience was as well. And I'm sure some of them would love to stay in touch and to follow you. I know I look at your Instagram feed. What is the best way for people to be in contact or stay up to date on what you're doing?
Well, I have a blog site called CherylBachelder.com, or you can search for it. It's called Serving Performs. My whole thesis is that serving people and serving an enterprise well is the path to superior performance. So I write about that. I tweet about that. At CA Bachelder is my Twitter feed, and I also am on Facebook at Cheryl Bachelder. So I would love to continue this dialogue with people. I do read all my social sites, and I do respond. So I would love any of you that are interested in these topics to join us in this conversation about leadership and share your thoughts.
Well, Cheryl, thank you for serving our audience today. I will make sure I put the links in the show notes so everybody has a chance to follow up. And I appreciate you sharing your insights and helping everyone in our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I wish everyone a lot of courage in their pursuit. I know you'll make a real difference.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Cheryl Bachelder. She explained in such a simple way how someone goes and develops in their career, builds a brand and a reputation, and then how that translates across into different companies who are looking for board expertise in certain areas. And then literally explained how then she went from one board to another and how it grew and developed. Incredibly successful person, serving on major high-profile companies that we would recognize. Names like Chick-fil-A, Pier 1 Imports, U.S. Foods. She's been there and she's done it, and she made it highly accessible to all of us. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to all the notes that we talked about today, including Cheryl's book. Now, the Boardroom Bound team and I are proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, promote, and empower you to land a board seat. And if you enjoyed this episode or any other episode of the podcast, I would greatly appreciate if you would open up Stitcher or iTunes or Google Play, wherever you're listening to this. And in just 30 seconds, you can leave an honest rating and review. And this is essential for how we get word out about the show. It's that sort of word-of-mouth feel. Now, thanks for joining me in this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.